Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
I have always had a really happy, optimistic disposition. And it wasn't even at first, after my TBI, that I started feeling depression. I think it was maybe 2 years in, and I just couldn't understand what was happening. It got to the point where I didn't want to be around anymore. It was just so much pain and so much to take on, but I was able to get that core disposition back. And I don't want anyone else to do that to themselves. I don't want this gross stigma preventing anyone from getting help.
Welcome to Talking Head Pain, the podcast that confronts head pain head on. I'm your host, Sarah Shaw, Senior Manager of BIPOC Community Outreach at the Global Healthy Living Foundation. I have been living with chronic migraine for almost 10 years, and I'm very open about navigating life with my chronic disease journey as well as my experience living with anxiety. This podcast will be a window into other patients' lives as they navigate their own journeys living with chronic pain, migraine, and mental health. Today, we're joined by Kellie, a migraine advocate and TBI patient in the migraine community. We'll have a deep conversation with her and leave no stone unturned in regards to Kellie's chronic illness journey. We'll be digging into depression, suicide, among other mental health topics that often go hand in hand with living with a chronic illness. It's important that we have these conversations to help battle stigma and help others feel less alone and get the support they need. Hi, Kellie. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have this conversation. So, Kellie, I like to start off every podcast by asking people what their worst migraine attack was like. Do you mind walking us through that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would have to say it was probably last summer. There was a point where I just couldn't get out of such a bad vomiting cycle. And it got to the point that my partner and my mom, they were begging me to go to the hospital. But I've had so many bad experiences with that in the past where you're just dismissed. You're not given help. You have to explain so much when you can't even form a sentence together. So I was so resistant to it. And I think I was lying, in my bathroom. And the only point that I was like, okay, you can take me if you will do all the talking for me, if you'll do all the advocacy for me, because I think I'm going to die if I keep going through this.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point that you bring up. We know as migraine patients, the emergency room is kind of one of the worst places for us. It's really loud. The lights are super bright. There's a lot going on and it's hard. I like that you brought up about your family members and loved ones advocating for you. I bring my partner along with me to almost every single doctor's appointment that I go to where I feel that she can help advocate for me, support me, bring up things that maybe I forgot to mention. And because she sees me every day and she's like, okay, I know that you had a lot of migraine attacks last month. We should bring that up to the doctor. Or remember when you did X, Y, and Z. And I think utilizing our loved ones as part of our migraine toolkit is an amazing thing to help us advocate for each other. So I'm really glad that you brought that up and that your family members can advocate for you.
So much so. I am 30 and I still bring my mom to all of my appointments. And it's amazing. She is so diligent about note taking, things I forget, or if I'm flustered in the moment, there's so much to remember and so many things to bring up that you really do forget so many things and you get so anxious and there's just so much. And especially if it's an ER situation, to do all the performances we have to jump through to get care in those situations, it can be near impossible when you're feeling at your absolute worst. And it's just so nice to have someone you can trust and will drop anything to be there. It's amazing.
Absolutely. It's really good. I'm glad that you have those loved ones and care partners, at hand to help you with that. Just from, being in the migraine world and just we all kind of know each other, but haven't always met. I know that you have a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. Do you mind walking us through your traumatic brain injury diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was 19 and before this point, I didn't have a migraine attack ever. I used to get car sick a lot as a child, which looking back, that was probably it. I fainted a lot, which looking back, I probably had POTS my entire life, but we just didn't really care too much about it just because it wasn't so prominent that it was controlling every aspect of my life. And so when I was 19, I went hiking when I was in college and I got a tick bite and I got Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which we didn't actually find out until maybe 6 months later when your doctor just did like a shot in the dark blood test and was like, oh, here's what's continuing all of the brain damage and etc. But then I went to a friend's art performance and it was standing room only. And again, with the POTS, I've never really been great at standing, but definitely with the tick bite coming into play, I fainted and I just hit my head. So all I was doing was standing, and this was the worst concussion of my life. I had had so many before, and, you know, you'd be over it in 2 days. So I never thought it was serious, you know, especially as a teenager. I thought it was sort of a badge of honor, you know, like playing soccer and be like, yeah, I'm so tough. Like, please don't do that. But anyway, so I was really bad and I wasn't really stringing sentences together. And my friend Holly was with me and she convinced me to go to the hospital because I was like, I'm fine. Like, this happens all the time. Like, it's nothing. And then she was like, I want to call your mom. And I was like, I don't know. She's going to worry. It's late at night. You know, she doesn't live in the city, but she did. And thank God. And so my mom came up, and then I just never returned to college for a couple years after, until I was so excited. I finally got into what was considered like Virginia's top neurologist. And it was 2 years after my concussion. And I was horrible. I was in such a bad state, but I so desperately wanted to get some semblance of control and my life back. I missed my goals. I missed like my social life. And so I was like, so what do I have to do to get back to school? I will do anything. I would love to do anything. And that neurologist said the thought of me ever going back to school was laughable. Both term.
Wow. That's really, really horrible.
But then, you know, that day I was just like, okay, well, if it's never going to happen, I might as well try now. So I went back that semester and it was absolutely brutal, horrible, but I was able to finish, which is really cool. But still, even to this point, I can't work full time. I can't. Every second of my life is dictated by my symptoms. Everything I do is dependent on this. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer.
No, I appreciate you taking us into that journey, and also the reality that is the reality for so many people living with chronic illnesses like migraine, like TBIs, with a bunch of other chronic illnesses. I think I first just want to address that when we're in pain and when we're not able to do a lot of things, we can do them, but with accommodations. Like, we can do them, but maybe at a slower pace, or we can do them, but I'll need to be in my bed with my laptop, or I'll need like reduced screen time, or I'll need an extension on papers, and I'll need time to take tests. You know, I didn't start experiencing severe migraine attacks until after I graduated. And one of the things that I think would have made it really challenging for me is if I would have been more chronic when I was undergrad. But I also, you know, now learned that there were accommodations that could have been put in place for me. I was on a 504 program for my attention deficit disorder when I was younger. And all of this is relating to the fact that people living with chronic illnesses are valuable. We just interact with the world differently. And I want to touch on what you mentioned about, you know, you can't like hold like a full-time job. And I wanted to connect that to something that I know about you is that I believe you work with migraine at work. Do you want to like talk to us a little bit about that transition from not finishing university, but not being able to like work full-time? What led you to migraine at work? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the things I'm most excited about because, like you said, we can do so much valuable stuff if we are just given accommodations, if we're given the room to thrive. Even the professors, when I went back to college, whether I was able to pass that class or not was dependent on what were the teachers willing to do. Did they roll their eyes and be like, well, no, you have to be at the same playing field as everyone else. And being in a silent room isn't really giving me a leg up on someone else, but it would make it possible for me to actually go through this. And that definitely translates into my work for Migraine at Work, because if people just took these accommodations seriously, the amount of value we could bring to every situation is just so much. And disabled people have so much to offer, and we can do so much, but it's often just so dismissed because people are fearful of the unknown and they're afraid like, oh, what if I do this? And it might be, they make up these situations in their head that we're just going to abuse the system. And that's just not true at all.
There is this stigma, especially against invisible illnesses for like migraine, fibromyalgia, even like mental health, like anxiety and depression. I feel like society puts this pressure on us that we're not even pressure, but they perceive us as being quote unquote lazy or taking advantage of the situation. That could be like the farthest thing from the truth. Like, I don't know how to explain this, but we want to do everything. We just need the world to interact with us differently, and then we can work alongside it. And I wanted to touch back about what you're doing at Migraine at Work and how you're helping so many people.
Yeah. So back to how you asked, like, how did I get involved with all of this? I was able to just live with my parents and not work after college because I truly was not able to. And I was very privileged. I love them a lot. It wasn't like a bad situation. Most people don't have that. I felt very lucky, but I was able just to sort of do full-time research. And I always wanted to be a neurological physical therapist, so like working with Alzheimer's and stuff like that. So I loved being able to break articles down and make it actually accessible to patients. That worked really well. So for a while, I was just able to research, and I had my own website where I would just put the blogs, and it's called Concussion Game Plan. And then I found the Migraine World Summit, and it was like the best resource I had found thus far, and I really loved it. And so I started volunteering with them, and I've been doing their social media along with a huge team since that point. And through that, I got close with the founders, especially Carl. And he was like, "You're good at this. Like you can do this. Would you want to come on for Migraine at Work? It's one of our associated nonprofits. You know how to," like, he went through a similar thing. He had to quit his job entirely. He had his entire life dictated by chronic migraine. And because I have my boss who gets it and knows, like, I cancel a meeting 5 minutes before, it's not because I'm flighty or I'm flaky. It's because I can't. I'm trying my hardest. And I just wish everyone could have that kind of support. So what we're doing for that is we're trying to get even just education and accommodation programs into workplaces. There's been a lot of studies that, most people with migraine are not, on our level. They're not dealing with this 24/7. They're not dealing with this constantly. And there's so many people, especially who are still episodic, that if they had the education, they could turn their lives around and they could never go down the alleyway of chronic migraine. They could never get to the intractable state. And even if they are in that intractable state, if their employers are willing to provide this education, these new medicine options, these like accommodations, there's just so much that we could be doing and making workplaces available for people like us. And I think that's truly amazing. And so I love it. I love getting on webinars and just telling people that, hey, even if you're like, migraine is largely genetic. So a lot of us have had relatives be like, oh, I went to the doctor and they said, there's nothing you can do. So don't waste your time. But like 2018, really changed the game. It was the first preventative actually designed for migraine. And there's just so much now that people don't know if they're not living, breathing, reading, researching migraine all day.
It's really ironic what you bring up. I remember when I first started working out of college, that was 3 months later, I had my first migraine attack. It was episodic. And then throughout the years, it went from episodic to chronic. And during my, I'll call it my migraine journey to getting more educated about it and talking about it, when I was hospitalized and I had to kind of tell my employer, I'm in the hospital for these migraine attacks that just won't break. And it was just so interesting how when I came back to work, 4 or 5 other people were like, oh my God, I get migraine attacks too. And it was just this thing of just openly talking about something that they were like, oh yeah, I get this. And I see this neurologist or I do this. So everyone was kind of walking around with this knowledge, but because we weren't talking about our pain, because in society, especially as women, we're not supposed to talk about those things. But I saw a light bulb go off. And the next employer that I went to, the same thing. I was more confident then. And I was like, yeah, I get chronic migraine. I get 15 plus headache days per month. And they're like, oh yeah, I get migraine too. And I see a neurologist. And it was just this theme that kept happening again and again. And I just feel if we all would have talked about it and shared resources, we could really help a lot of people get on better treatment or even see a neurologist. There were a few people that I had come across. They're like, oh yeah, I get migraine attacks. I'm like, oh, are you seeing a neurologist? And they were like, no. But some of it all also has to do with like access to, insurance issues. Like we talk about all of these things, and just, I was listening to what you were saying about, if it's genetic and someone in their family has it, but then they're like, oh, I went to a doctor and they didn't do any help. They're not going to help you. And I think we've really seen migraine education, resources, medication like evolve, especially like you mentioned since 2018. And now that these newer treatments and better treatments are out there, it's such a shame that there's so many people that just don't have access. I can't even say don't have the education, don't have the access to the education. And what Migraine at Work is doing is putting that at like the center of discussions, so that way employees can get better and feel better. I think the more we talk about it, the more we have webinars and podcasts and articles that talk about something that for so long, so many people, especially women, were not talking about. We were just grinning and bearing it, I think is so important. I talk a lot about like mental health on this podcast, and I like to bring it around of what do you do for yourself that like is like feeding your soul and is you're doing self-care.
Yeah, so that's a big one. I think it's important for me to like go back. So I have always had a really happy, optimistic disposition. I think I was born that way. I think that was my just overall, like I always wanted every person I met, I want to be their friend. Like I want to have so much fun always. And it wasn't even at first after my TBI that I started feeling depression. I think it was maybe 2 years in, and I just couldn't understand what was happening. It got to the point where I didn't want to actively kill myself, but I knew that the next time I got really sick, because my immune function had been severely impacted by it, I was just not going to go. I was not going to tell people. I was not going to go to the doctors, and I would just let that happen. So that way my loved ones didn't have to deal with it. But I didn't want to be around anymore. It was just so much pain and so much to take on. And because it was a slow, gradual process, I don't even know if I recognized it as depression at the time. And because I always thought, oh, I'm so happy, like this is great, yada yada. Whenever one of my doctors suggested that, I really pushed back. And then I think I was sort of, in my mind, I was tricked into taking antidepressants because they're like, oh, it's a migraine preventative. And so that way I was like, all the stigma I had like about myself, and I wasn't being grateful enough, and I wasn't realizing I still got to live with my loving family. And I hate that I had that, but I did. And then I realized, oh, my life is okay again. This helped a lot. Why did I go so far denying this when life is hard enough? Give yourself help.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why would I contribute like that extra stigma to what I was going through? It was a terrible thing to do to myself. Like, I could have gotten so many, like a couple years of my life back where I didn't just truly hate every minute. And I hate that I had that. But like you said, like the caregiving thing, like I would never say that to someone else, but I felt it for myself, and it sucks. And there's like one stat that I was even saying and like telling to other people, but it was nearly 1 in 5 brain injury survivors report suicidal ideation plans or attempts in the 5 years after. But for some reason I couldn't be like, oh, but that's also me. Like something about it, I was just not being honest, and it was horrible. I hate that I did that, but I'm so glad that someone, quote, tricked me into taking medication and helping myself get through that. And I didn't need it forever. And then once I got to a place where I wasn't sobbing every day, I could take like some of my other like self-care and like treatments that were more holistic and like more things I was like a little bit more comfortable with. Then I could get back to that place of like happiness. And I'm still in so much pain, and there's still so many days I like break down all the time, but I was able to get that core function and like that like disposition back. And I don't want anyone else to do that to themselves. I don't want this gross stigma preventing anyone from getting help and letting themselves suffer to a degree. We're already suffering. Life is hard. Life is hard for every person. Like, give yourself a little help. If you need help, you're not tougher for not getting help. It's really hard to get help.
It's very hard to get help. And I want to touch on a few points of what you said, Kelly. Like, number one, being gentle on yourself. I think it's really hard with mental health, and I live with very severe anxiety. When you're in it, it's really hard to see what it is that you're going through until you're able to take a step back and be like, okay, I went through a really bad patch for 5 months where I was having this. And I feel like I also have to state that I appreciate the statistic that you brought up about TBI patients. Anxiety and depression go hand in hand with migraine. I feel like there's so many people that I talk to where they have one or the other, anxiety or depression and migraine, or just anxiety and migraine, or depression and migraine, or CPTSD and migraine. I feel like it's so common, but it's not talked about enough. And you talked about stigma, and we talk about the way the world views mental health. And even like growing up in TV shows, in movies, depression and anxiety were kind of taboo, or like seeing like a therapist, which they used to call shrinks. Like there had to be something like wrong with you. And like, you're like, you're like broken, and like you need like to see a professional to get help. And like, it was like, oh, you need a shrink. And like now looking back, I definitely internalized the way that society views mental health, anxiety, and depression, to the point where even though I said I was like a mental health advocate 5 or 6 years ago, when I suddenly got diagnosed with anxiety and I had my first panic attack and I was prescribed an anxiety medication, I felt this shame of needing to take a medication for my anxiety. And my therapist and I had a really like candid conversation about it. I brought it up to her and she was like, Sarah, when you get a migraine attack, do you take your medication? I was like, yeah, of course. No, I do. And she's like, why can't that be the same for you when you have anxiety? And we obviously went through the background of like stigma and society and women and all of these other barriers, especially like being a woman of color, a queer woman of color, like all those different like layers that like get us to this point. And I think you brought up a really important point about depression and suicidal ideation, and bringing up such a topic on a podcast, I think is really important for other people to hear. To one, know that they're not alone. And to two, there's this meme that like I always see like going around on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter or X, is it's a pill bottle and it's like full of like cats, and it's like store-bought neurotransmitters are absolutely fine. Like it's okay if you need to get your dopamine from like medication. And I want to see more of that. I want us to continue to have these conversations to let people know there's nothing wrong with you, that you just need a little cat prescription to get you through your day or to get you through a really rough patch. And it doesn't matter if it takes 2 months to a week to 6 months, however long you need it to get back to that level, that's okay. And we're going to have bad days. Being in pain sucks. It does. I'm not going to beat around the bush with that. But I think sharing stories like yours, talking about the real things, lets so many people know they're not alone and that they have a buddy to get through those rough spots. So thank you for bringing that up and having that really vulnerable conversation with us and for our listeners.
I feel like very much like what you're saying. First of all, yes, I love that meme. But also, I felt that way when I saw medical PTSD in my chart. I was like, that is so wrong that I have so much privilege. How could I have PTSD? You know, like I didn't suffer like a horrible like mugging, or I didn't go to war, or yada yada. And I thought it was somehow taking away from other people to say that I had that. And no, not at all. If anything, it's supporting them, knowing that it doesn't have to be this ridiculous option. I went through so many doctors telling me this wasn't real, or this was, just get over it. And because I had never heard of like medical PTSD, I thought there was no way, because I never did anything brave. I was just going to the doctor. And for some reason, I thought that would take away from other people's pain. And that's not how the world works at all.
Yeah. Going to the doctor is brave. It is. Like, I feel like I have to gear up, have all of my lists. Okay, here's my list of things that I need to bring up to my doctor. Like, okay, let me start back when I was 12 and walk you through my entire history. I think, going to the doctor is brave. It's vulnerable, but then also it can be really good. Like, I have now some really great experiences with a few of my doctors. They know me, that I'm an advocate. I'm able to have conversations with them about what has worked, what hasn't worked, what I'm traumatized by. You know what I mean? I feel like that's what I wish for everyone, is to have these conversations with their doctors to not only help them feel good, but feel good longer. I want to thank you, Kellie, for coming on the podcast today and having this conversation with us. I know that it's going to impact a lot of patients. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for doing all of this. It's incredible and I love it. And I think it, like you said, it is helping and reaching so many people and so many groups that just get passed over. And I think with all of the work any of us are doing, if it touches one person who had no idea that other people were going through this, I think it's so incredible and so important. And I'm so proud. And I thank you for doing all the work you're doing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Talking Head Pain, the podcast that confronts head pain head on. If you like this episode, please give it an honest 5-star rating, write a positive review, and spread the word by sharing with your friends and family. It'll help more people like you find us. If you or a loved one are experiencing mental health-related distress, particularly if the thought or feeling is new or has increased recently, you can call or text the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988 for help at any time. This lifeline provides free and confidential support for people in distress, prevention, and crisis resources. I'm Sarah Shaw, and I will see you next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.